Hello everyone, today we talk about drinking in medieval France. Once upon a time I decided that there was too few medieval, at least comprehensive French history content, especially one that could look at France in its ensemble rather than the various local histories that of course are included within this content with particular care, by the way. So that I decided to start talking about even this more apparently generic and or maybe even banal um, topics that, however, are the key to, I think, a more complete vision of medieval France. This is not really a trivial idea, because if you even Google book on medieval French history as a whole, it's actually very rare to find anything coming even close to that, right? There are some comprehensive things like, I don't know, the Encyclopedia of Medieval France, but this sense of having a general overview over the country as a whole is quite not there. There's a lot about England, there is a lot about Germany or Italy. When it comes to France, that was actually, and politically, in many ways, one of the single most compact realities, aside from being the bigger system, so also provided largely with a degree of homogeneity, especially from the Atlantic side of the watershed. In medieval Europe, you don't find this unitary. So, again, today's topic is very, I don't know how to say this, not necessarily mundane just per se, but of course it can, as we'll see now, help to even look at more material side of the story, something that we tend to skip, but still understanding its functionality, what was behind that, also in a moral fashion, of course, at the time. First of all, drinking. We'll talk more about drinks specifically, beverage, how it was made, what purpose it had, how it sort of fit the general cultural background. But there is also a very concrete aspect of medieval lifestyle, infrastructure, science, etc., that we will see surely in some other video. We address, for example, the public hygiene for the Italian commutes. We looked at construction material during, I don't remember, I think it was like the 11th to 12th century. And the issue of supplying communities with water or having access to fresh, clean pools of water, of course, is crucial at so many levels. It's actually the most important thing you can imagine. And obviously, as a consequence, water was just as important a means to slake thirst in the Middle Ages as it is today. Also in a more combined way with other drinks. In many urban areas of medieval France, access to clean water was severely limited. Right, pandemic concentration brought that big issue. We talked about this in the video about medieval Paris, how the city developed connected with the various quarters connected with the Seine and other pools of water. Especially from the 14th century, you start seeing a greater development of infrastructure, especially in the bigger centers, to provide water to these masses. Also with some important control on the quality of the same water, because, of course, this concentration brought to a great deal of pollution already at the time. And so the deteriorating conditions of rivers and streams often rendered such pools unsuitable for drinking. Additionally, societal customs and beliefs about health influenced water consumption, with many considering it insufficient for quenching thirst at meals. And just as we must today be cautious about the source of potable water, so 600 years ago, streams and rivers running through urban areas tended to become too polluted to afford safe drinking water. Normally, the dug well was vital to any community. Wells often served as social gathering points as well, where neighbors would exchange news and community ties were strengthened. They really were baptized with the same water. This was really relevant also at a local parochial level. People who had access to a spring or a fountain could consider themselves fortunate at the time. Their water was valued for its clarity and its dependable purity. Much could be said about this topic regarding the provisions of water in the early Middle Ages. Some, very few, admittedly, houses in what had become France, was becoming France, still received water from aqueducts. This was an actual thing. It was much more common, of course, in the Mediterranean world. Southern Gaul was one of the single most intensely Romanized places of the empire. But, of course, the infrastructure system decayed rapidly, especially from the second half of the 6th century. And the type of settlement, the type of endemic distribution of medieval times wouldn't actually render the aqueducts necessary like before, at least not until the end of the Middle Ages, when in some cases the same Roman aqueducts were reactivated and or used to, if anything, like supplement other types of water distribution. That's a topic I leave entirely for another video because it's not even so systemically impacting. Water was not considered to be a proper beverage at meals in general. This is an interesting aspect of not just medieval but ancient history. This perspective came from a belief that water could be harmful to digestion and overall health, at least according to some concepts that were not necessarily followed, also because people would drink mostly water, of course. And to accompany food and to aid digestion, however, a mildly fermented drink of some sort was usually available, which is in fact something different from today. Today we drink proportionally much more water than other drinks, at least normally during an average meal. At the time, these beverages not only provided refreshment but also reflected, in fact, a word today lost, that is the one of agricultural practices and preferences of different regions as well. Right, everything that, especially in a world that had very low crop yields, that tended to salvage everything to make the best use possible of every resource. Of course, drinking was that important through the use of particular substances that were actually beneficial, that were actually better than just water. In some circumstances, helped the general consumption, digestion. Especially the presence of alcohol reduced the risk of bacterial contamination in a beverage that, as you understand, we will see in the end especially, was of course very high. Right? What we said before about, for example, the gradual degree of pollution, water pollution during the later Middle Ages, was true also in other ways, but we have this idyllic sense of how people lived at the time. Actually, they lived in pretty dire situations, and even just the smokes of the fires, the general promiscuity with animals, the lack, of course, of all the contemporary hygienic precautions, means treatment and so on, made everything potentially lethal. All right, so what you put in your drink was also through sort of course, traditional wisdom that was in an important part tested. Like lots of beliefs regarding certain properties of certain substances was somehow fantasy, just for how it is it was handed down to us, how it was described at a point. But we do know that many remedies were actually very effective, and many of this revolved around drinking, of course. Depending upon both tradition and the strengths of regional agriculture, this drink varied in France. Among, for example, beer, the cervoise, already in Old French, used generally in northeastern areas. And in Paris, when wine was unavailable, it was still preferential. Latin Europe had historically been the one of the wine. The Romans essentially stopped where they couldn't use must for the preservation of the very large food supplies necessary for the legions. This had naturally to do overall also with the general agricultural output. The French weather, of course, is much more mitigated, just like the one of Britain by the Atlantic currents. It's not as cold, say, as Central Europe or Scandinavia. So this had literally created different, not simply different areas of Europe. There were many different sort of overlapping drink and food cultural areas. However, France typically remains famous for wine since literally antiquity. It had been the Romans actually, the Etruscans, to have introduced viticulture to Gaul, even though probably things would have developed anyway by themselves, and cultivated a great deal of this specialty, also late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages. So beer actually was considered a poorer drink, of course, that you would have when wine was not available. In medieval France, beer was not just a single product, but a category, of course, with significant variability in quality, characteristics. Different regions had their own brewing techniques and preferences, often influenced by local grains and climate. For example, the northern regions of France favored darker ales made with barley, while light golden ales were more common in areas where wheat was abundant. The northern regions favored darker ales made with barley, while light golden ales were more common in areas where wheat was abundant. In northern France and along the borders of Flanders, bière de garde was prevalent. Brewed with a higher alcohol content and maltier profile, this beer, the bière de garde, was stored for aging and often enjoyed in cooler seasons. It used local grains such as barley and oats and was sometimes flavored with herbs and spices. While not strictly French, the innovation of lambic-style beers fermented with wild yeast and bacteria in neighboring Belgium influenced some regions in northern France as well. Brewers began to adopt similar spontaneous fermentation techniques, creating uniquely flavored beers that reflected their local terroir. Beer was commonly brewed at home, and the quality and flavor varied significantly based on local ingredients and brewing methods. Proper storage was difficult and expensive, and the product was retailed as soon as it was drinkable. We will see later what were other precise means of beverage preservation, but also what could be the direct consequences in such a failure. Two varieties of beer were recognized: a better grade from barley or spelt, and a small one from wheat and rye, oats, vetch, and virtually any other grain. Some of these were very mixed. As you understand, this is really typical, again, of pre-industrial cultures. Like, they threw in everything they had. There were some, this is true also for food, as you know, there were these huge cauldrons at a time, and they were always boiling at low fire, and whatever these peasants had, they threw into the cauldron, and then this soup was very good, very energetic. Just as today, the reputation of wines depended upon their geographical source, the complex combination of soil, weather, and treatment. Regions like Bordeaux and Champagne, of course, became particularly famous for the quality of their wines, establishing early trends in viniculture. The Burgundian vineyards, however, produced the most valued type of wine. Hyperbolically, it was said around the 13th century that the Burgundian only activity was cultivating grape, selling the wine, and buying basically every other needed good through the income due to such wine export. Naturally, it was not possible. Most people sustained themselves with local food, but the surplus that this region historically had, we made a video about the Duchy of Burgundy. It was in fact also incredibly florid and politically compact, very early centralized and iron-fisted polity, dependent on the fluidity of its soil. Also, of course, the centrality in the heart of Europe helped a great deal, bordering northern France, Germany, southern France, northern Italy, and so all the main trade axis of Europe passing through the land. The French imported, however, also wines from abroad. For example, Greece, Cyprus, Palestine. This was particularly the case during the Crusading era, and also the French conquest of the Byzantine Empire, the establishment of the Latin one, and so an actual direct control of the Hellenic wine production. Say that this Outremer wine, let's call it like this, had a certain vogue, even in such a massive wine producer like France. The trade of these wines showcased medieval France's connections, of course, to the wider Mediterranean world. Of course, the same France is very composite itself, and so you have great wine in the north, great wine in the south, but there are differences that we're going to look at now. Apart from Burgundy and Bordeaux, other notable wine-producing regions included the Loire Valley, known for its white wines like Sancerre and Vouvray. The Rhône Valley also became significant, producing both red and white varieties. In southern regions, particularly near the Mediterranean, herbal and spiced wines began to gain popularity. In warmer regions like Languedoc and Roussillon, a method called moutage was employed to stop fermentation early by adding spirits, leading to sweeter fortified wines. This ancient technique allowed vintners to create luscious wines that showcased the natural sweetness of the grapes while also increasing alcohol content. The diversity of soil types and local climates contributed to the vast differences in flavor profiles found across these regions. Late harvest grapes were left on the vine longer to develop higher sugar content. Techniques like passing the grapes through hot air, similarly to drying, intensified sweetness, resulting in wines that mirrored styles found in Mediterranean countries. Different grapes became associated with particular areas. The Pinot Noir grape, for instance, became a signature varietal of Burgundy by the late Middle Ages already, the famous Pinot Noir, dating to that time and before likely, because of course there is all an ancestry of this that is also interesting to explore, while Gamay was valued in regions around Beaujolais. Wine was often blended, as we were pointing out before, with vintners experimenting to create the best possible profiles according to customer preferences as well. Everything was very ad hoc, right? Just like armor. There was a level of homogeneity, but as we will see now, the social status connected with wine, particularly qualitative one, was actually a big deal. Right? This natural goods, still to the beginning, the mid 13th century, were really a huge deal in terms of wealth and prestige. I think in Burgundy, once a town or a local nobleman gifted Louis IX with a pike, like the fattest pike of the local pond. That was a royal gift, accepted, of course, as such. This would continue for a long time. I was reading something about Louis XIV passing by Bayonne that apparently gifted the court with something like over 300 hams. So you have to see this. Many European specialties were already there, as we're seeing here. We've seen it in the Italian communes. The wealth of agriculture, especially in these two countries, were the bigger, like the ones with the greater agricultural output, greater fertility, as opposed to the cultivation, the refinement, probably the artistry in food that so much we know still today. Along the preserve of lords, the vineyard became, from the 10th century at the latest, also a peasant concern. This is really important because, as we've seen, Gallo-Roman culture had a big deal of senatorial, later episcopal care of essentially pretty large estates that hadn't really been disrupted like in England or in Italy from late antiquity. So possessing a vineyard, a bit like a wood or some other, say, some ponds, some natural resources of this kind, was really a privilege, right, and an elite status. From the 10th century, we start seeing, of course, the system, first of all, stabilizing from post-Carolingian times, and at that point, like the feudal system expanding dramatically, bringing the same peasants at the bottom of the ladder, however, to enjoy of the material consequences of such wealth, this production. Drinking one's own wine, this was the statement defining the quintessential sign of social success. Of course, even relatively humble individuals could have this. Thus, drinking practices acted as markers of social certification. The types of wines and beverages one consumed often indicated one's social status. For instance, aristocrats typically enjoyed sweet, spiced wines, while peasants had access to simpler, more rustic brews. I will not digress, of course, on the great sort of drinking culture connected with the comitatus, with the nobility. That was a mark of status. It's not like the peasants, especially in France, wouldn't drink wine. Otherwise, it was actually pretty common. There were all different qualities, so that wasn't much the deal. We've seen it could be diluted, etc. But it's this connection with the wine production and accessibility, availability that really makes a difference. And this is even more evident at the end of the Middle Ages, when such powerful courts like the one of the Valois or the Valois Burgundy really created banquets that were veritable, say, shows, right, of entertaining the hosts with this extremely elaborated food and effects and so on. And of course, for example, deploying all the arsenal of wines coming from all different regions of France and beyond was a pretty impressive way of showing off. Some of this wine could be extremely expensive, right? Just like, I don't know, a manuscript in the Middle Ages was incredibly expensive. A warhorse was extremely expensive. For selecting such a particularly qualitative type of wine, hundreds and hundreds of people had to work, not just in the vineyard, but of course in all the preparation, etc. And of course the market made the price as well. So of course in the later Middle Ages, the French nobility had consistently urbanized, even though they still lived in their own country castles, including royalty. But of course their main place, say, arena of political action, etc., around the city, where they had, in fact, major mansions that were also much more directly connected with the bigger markets. This, to begin with, had brought to that broader wine availability to all estates that commercialization was a consequence of. Just like, I don't know, in the 14th century, even a humble archer could have a sword, something that in the 11th century was not quite the case. Similarly, a greater amount of people could drink wine after the early High Middle Ages. And this shift, of course, reflects broader social changes in France during the period, as agricultural reforms allowed for more widespread participation in wine production. France was, of course, sort of the most agriculturally advanced world since Carolingian times, together with northern Italy. They really had a much greater sense of management and organization, rationalization of such production and resources distribution. Alcohol was a staple in the daily diet of many medieval French citizens, by later times providing not just hydration, but also calories, of course. That was a very underappreciated part of the story that, as you know, however, is not also going much towards a positive direction. A lot of energy, but not much to build on. This is what alcoholism would turn into in a more systematically social fashion, as you know, during industrial times, mass society. In many cases, it was safer than water in many ways. Even children were offered small amounts of watered down wine or beer as a routine part of their upbringing. The citizen had every opportunity to have a drink and warm himself at one of the many taverns. In the 14th century, apparently 66 only in Avignon, the papal city, by the way. Taverns served not only as places to drink, but, as you know, also social hubs where people gathered to share news, stories, and entertainments. Specific drinking rituals were, of course, observed during feasts and gatherings. For instance, wine would be poured from a particular height to aerate it before being served, a practice believed to enhance the wine's flavors. For example, in Spain, I'm pretty sure they do that still, which actually makes it all spilling over, and that's a thing. It's a medieval legacy. Toasting before drinking was also customary, meant to promote goodwill and camaraderie among diners. Such an enormous business revolving around wine, especially in France, would bring to taxes on the sale of the same drinks in general, which guaranteed the best level of return. These taxes were called sucre in Aquitaine, courtepinte in Burgundy, bio or appétissement in Brittany, cider and mead, that is hydromel from a fermented mixture of honey and water, particularly in its flavored forms as Médon and Bergerac, enjoyed local appeal in northern France. Cider in particular became an integral part of diet in regions like Normandy, where apple cultivation thrived. It was produced from specific apple varieties, like bitter sharp apples and low sugar ones. The fermentation process employed natural yeast from the apple skins, and some producers utilize a method called méthode champenoise for sparkling cider. This technique involved secondary fermentation in the bottle. Cider was not only consumed by the lower estates, but was also appreciated by the nobility, especially as a refreshing alternative to wine during harvest festivals. These communal events were occasions for townspeople to come together, often resulting in the creation of unique local drinks, such as vin de la fête, so the wine of the festival, produced solely for these very special occasions. In regions with abundant pear orchards, particularly near the Loire Valley, Poiré, that is pear cider, became popular. Production was similar to apple cider with specific pear varieties, such as Williams and Boer pears, selected for their flavor profiles. The fermentation of pear juices highlighted unique fruity notes, distinct from apple cider. In areas where apples and pears grew alongside other fruits, brewers experimented with mixed fermentations. Berries, such as cherries or black currants, were commonly introduced, resulting in fruit blends that expanded the variety of beverages available. Winter festivals often featured vin chaud, so warm hot wine, a spiced and warm wine made by infusing red wine with spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves alongside citrus fruits. This drink was popular in colder months and considered both warming and healthful. Each region tended to have, as we have understood, its own unique blend of spices based on local availability and tradition. Certain special wines were customarily served as aperitifs, cordials, and digestives at formal meals. For instance, Grenache was commonly used to literally open the stomach. In such means, at formal meals, beverages were generally served at designated times throughout the courses. Before the main meal, it was common, for example, to have lighter drinks such as small beer or wine diluted with water, transitioning to richer wines as the meal progressed. In southern regions, such as Provence, methods were developed to produce sweet dessert wines. These were often created by infusing local wines with herbs such as thyme, rosemary, and citrus zest, resulting in drinks akin to modern vermouth. They served not only as aperitifs, but were also used in cooking, right? And all this, of course, highlights the importance of beverage pairing in the culinary traditions of the time. There is another aspect connected with beverages that we're highlighting before, that is to say, its role in medicine, right? In the pursuit of general health, right? Medical fate, especially in the powder of spices, both to promote digestion and to ensure healthy balance of corporal humors, for how they were understood at the time, led to the elaboration of fortified wines. We've seen it as before. And one of these was the Hippocras, which obviously is named after the authority of Hippocrates. The Hippocras was thus a spiced wine believed to aid digestion and circulation. It was also the Claret, was yet another fortified wine, and essentially spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves were added for both flavor and their presumed health benefits, reflecting the blend of culinary and medical knowledge and belief. These fortified wines often incorporated not just spices per se, but say a variety of herbs, right? This flavoring was also provided for wines in the same way, right? By wormwood, the absinthe, aloes, hyssop, myrtle, anise, rosemary, cloves, sage, and musk. A number of other beverages derived as well from the realm of medicine, often by way of their use as ingredients in special cookery. Fruit juices, for example, particularly from pears and plums, became popular in their own right and were consumed for refreshment and health. Natural fruit juices, Poiré and Prunelle, from the aforementioned pears and plums, respectively, for example, and in particular citric juices, because of their bitterness, were so used from the end of the 14th century. Finally, ground flower petals even lent a scent and flavor to water, right? The Burgundian court, for example, was quite ahead in this kind of thing. You would think of them being sort of effeminated customs, but actually the dukes of Burgundy individually cared, at least some of them, very much about this. Hygiene is yet another aspect, because this was used for bathing, not just for food, right? And so everything was blended in ways that they also partially understood the consequences of, especially drinking. In any case, the artistry of infusing flavors into beverages was already a big deal since ever, and it became, in such a feudally and courtly developed France, a hallmark of haute cuisine during this period. It was about that shock effect in the finesse, in the expense as well, of this incredibly luxurious and researched products. Normally available for finger washing during a meal, an infusion of rose petals, rose, pink water, enjoyed extensive use, particularly in its distilled form, first as a medically prescribed therapeutic beverage, then as a beverage consumed for the maintenance. All right, they passed from washing their hands, because as you know, they essentially ate without. They had just some like a knife to keep things still, and then they would eat everything with their hands on a large bread plate that retain, in fact, all the juice, all the sauces. And this passed to be, say, understood as even a medically prescribed therapeutic beverage, used on food as well. This trend reflected the growing interest in culinary innovations, just per se, and the medicinal properties of herbs and flowers that, again, had all particular legacy and literature behind. The techniques of the still or alembic that we mentioned before provided the medieval physician with aqua vitae from various wines. But thirsty people soon realized that what was beneficial for the sick could be equally salutary for anyone. Briefly about wine making and preservation. In regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, we have medieval evidence for crushing grapes occurring by foot or with wooden presses, explicitly. The fermentation process often involved wild yeasts found on grape skins and in the environment, leading to unique regional characteristics. The length of fermentation varied based on desired sweetness and alcohol content. Wine in places like Burgundy was aged in oak barrels, which imparted distinct flavors and aromas, such as vanilla and toast. The age and type of barrel used could substantially affect the wine's character. Some regions opted for foudre, that is to say, large wooden vats for aging, allowing for microoxygenation and complex flavor development without overwhelming the wine with oakiness. Judging from the various tips on how to cure so-called sick wine, spoilage must have been a major problem. This issue prompted innovations in wine storage and the development of early preservation techniques impacting local wine-making practices. This tells you why, as we were pointing out before, for the nobility, the elite, like, wine could be that expensive, because they would pick just the finest within a market that was highly selective, also highly stratified. What you have always to consider is that for these masterpieces of ancient technique and application, there would be lots of other so-so products of the same type, and even bad ones, that of course occurred also for many reasons that could not be controlled. Think about, I don't know, poor harvest due to bad weather. All right, Cornicles, for example, are very attentive to this because, of course, the harvest was the base of everything, and this affected even these specialized crops, right? Production, as we've seen for example, the economy of a region like Burgundy were quite relevant in so many ways. So this gives you an idea of also how, in spite of, say, the changes, the technical improvements, like in modern contemporary winemaking, that of course has, at least in the most commercialized fashion, nothing to do with how they made wine at the time, but in sort of the truer way, that is often also not really competitive because it's done, in fact, at a smaller scale, etc. But really we can find the inheritance, the legacy of this ancient wisdom, of how wine was used to be made. I mean, if you look, people sometimes buy wine at the supermarket. Everywhere you tour in Europe, you have to stop by the road. You find these massive things. If you have traveled a lot, France itself, of course, is plenty of wine. It's sort of characteristic of the various countries. In Germany, you will find some kind of sweets or sausages. In Italy, you will find particular pastry or whatever they sell, and this, of course, is wine made. Of course, there is better, worse wine. So some of it is good, like if you're not particularly picky. But this stuff is made with essentially some simple solutions, right? They dissolve into. In fact, they taste all alike, which is ridiculous because notoriously every harvest, every year, it's something different, right? And that's how wine is. The good wine is used to be. For example, but not necessarily even. Sometimes people dispatch good wine for good wine. It's actually not the case. They also, in order to preserve it, they fill it with methanol. It's not like they used to do that, and the difference is astonishing. You can't understand it if you have any connection with the country, with how things were actually done traditionally, also on top of some millinery culture, and how just better, right, healthier, just even at the taste, like it's so much more flavorful, light, delicious, old ways, right, really make food, drinking, and so this is what we should think about this world, that it is somehow lost to a degree. Like, it's not like this topic is overwhelmingly documented in the sources to begin with, but it really, as you can understand even from these simple videos, constituted a universe, an ocean of technique, of skill, of patience, of hard work that encompassed like the whole world. And already by this point, the late Middle Ages, Europeans knew each other's wines, food, that everything was very much appreciated in these varieties, in these differences, in these comparisons. We still sort of compete on this stuff, as you know, and it's part of that background. You don't have to forget it historically because it's really relevant. From the later and better documented times, we realized that animal milk actually played a minor role in the aristocratic diet, at least as far as we can document. France was in this no different from the rest of late medieval Europe, with its love, not to say addiction, to almonds and almond milk. Almond milk was often seen as a luxurious alternative to regular milk, so there was actually this divide. Animal for the lower estates, almond for the upper ones. There are some inversions also in history. White bread, for example, today costs less than the rye one, just to make an example. Why? Because essentially now we can produce easily a lot of white bread, and so who does even search for rye wine if not for specific reasons? And so that happens on the market, of course, to cost more, right? The medievals would have been amazed at us in this sense. Now, this almond milk, I can't pronounce that, was commonly spiced and sweetened in various recipes, as well like the other beverages that we've seen. Now, the latter part of the medieval period saw innovations such as adopting sparkling techniques in certain regions for drinking. Also about wine, the use of secondary fermentation in bottle was beginning to emerge, laying the foundation for what would later develop into the sparkling wines of Champagne specifically. Consider that, for example, sugar was a big deal, so sugary water was apparently such a big deal of the great courts of Europe at this time. And so this all depends naturally on the type of market and the product's availability. And more. I'm glad we could talk about this topic. It's not like I will come back on it frequently. Last year or so I thought we could talk about medieval food as a sort of mini series, but at the same for different, based on in fact different countries, right? Every video on how did they eat in England or in Flanders, or this kind of stuff. This can be an idea. Frankly, I'm thinking about it, if anything, because it is, if anything, the pictures are difficult to find, to be very specific, but of course you can find plenty of stuff on the internet. You never know. Just be creative. If there weren't copyright restrictions, I would use, of course, everything possible, but that's not the case. I'm glad, however, more than else, that we are talking about a bit more about medieval France. This is the 97th video, judging from the playlist. Accepting that we haven't maybe forgotten anything about the videos we've made, feels still dreadfully few. Right? We should talk way more about medieval France in its specifics, especially political and military history. Right, there is really a lot. It was such a huge system that you just can't ignore its enormous complexity overall. How's Schwerpunkt faring in this regard? Well, in September, you've noticed there was a surge of views connected likely to some content that I wanted to make, and or people coming back home from vacations. I don't know what was that. The most interesting aspect, anyway, is that now it went down again. It's sort of weird because most of these views were not, I think, from other, like from YouTube recommendations. This stuff came from the actual subscriber. Let's call it in this way. So YouTube's ways are really, really mysterious. Because otherwise everybody would find a way to make views. What can I say? Let's just keep it up, right? We have different roles. I am continuing, of course, with the videos and everything. We should at some point reach pretty good levels here, and expanding on different topics naturally brings to the relative dilution, at least in the capacity to thicken the fabric, like this or that specific theme. However, again, it's always a mix of following the cycle in part and making this more ad hoc content. This is not the case. This was part of the cycle because of this greater impact that normally the in fact this sort of called specials really do, right? Sometimes, probably this video, for example, will not get too many views. I'm sort of aware of this. It's not much of a surprise to begin with. There is, however, some broader logic in return. I mean, from one side, if we entrusted ourselves just to the cycle, we likely wouldn't have the chance to discuss some of the more interesting topics. At the same time, the cycle is necessary because it forms, as we were saying before, this connective fabric that also the specials would not how to gravitate, to float on, and so there is always a balance between everything that is going on. The main issue is just to be complete, to give an idea of homogeneity also when the topics are so different, which I can just give myself through the fact that I'm the single common denominator in many ways, especially in the criticism, in the original dimension, also in the same choice, in the same picture, really, or how everything is organized. This video is interesting. We'll talk more about, say, medieval wine or stuff like that. I don't know in which context really, but it's definitely an interesting topic, and especially this time of the year gives you a sense of that world, that ghostly atmosphere that revolves around us, the historical meanings revolving around the works in the field, and how this reflected in the broader community and their beliefs and so on. So it is really important. We have to talk really about, if anything, more about the supernatural in this world and what this was connected with historically. Relatively brief video. I try to dilute it because, of course, there is always something interesting to say, to add, but that's also pretty much what we can appreciate now. For today, in fact, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.